All right, this is your first week video lecture about the foundation of constitutional law. This first chapter mostly deals with an introduction and the kind of history about the Constitution. So the U.S. Constitution represents the law. It's a body of rules promulgated to establish and support the norms of society enforced through legal means, i.e. punishment. The Constitution is the system of laws that establishes the nature, function, and really importantly, the limits of a government. Okay. Your book notes very specifically that we're in a pluralistic society and that we have multiple different groups and factions, and that has always been the case. In our country pre-Constitution, we were a colony from Great Britain. There was a lot of debt, which led to a lot of taxes on stamps and tea and quartering, requiring families to shelter and feed troops. They would just show up at your house and you would be required to feed them. There weren't grocery stores back then, so it was a huge deal and a huge burden on families. In 1774, we had our first Continental Congress. We had 55 delegates from the 12 colonies coming to Philadelphia. They agreed that we need a set of resolutions to define rights, liberties, and immunities of the colonists. And they called for the king to restore rights to Americans, and they established a boycott until their demands were met. This led to the Revolution, which was financed and led by those who had power. Then we have the Second Continental Congress, which establishes the Continental Army, names George Washington the commander. Congress serves the role of kind of supplying and funding the army, meeting with other countries, and this was a complete war. After this, in 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence. July 4th, 1776, Congress unanimously voted in favor of American independence. There were 5 sections of the Declaration of Independence. The first one explaining why it was issued. The second one declares that all men are equal, have equal rights to life, liberty, and happiness. The third paragraph explains how Britain is not honoring the rights, and the fourth paragraph describes their attempts to obtain justice. The fifth paragraph proclaims the independence. After that, briefly, we had the Articles of Confederation. The framers were really worried about too much power being concentrated in the hands of a central government. And so we see them put together this really weak central government that was essentially just supposed to kind of like mediate between the colonies, which would become the 13 states. This did not work well. And so just a couple years later, we have the framers coming back to the drawing board to start drafting the Constitution. The Magna Carta was the starting point for the colonists. And the primary goal of the Constitution was to take away total rule from a single individual. So in 1787, we have a convention called to initially start revision process. During these meetings, it became clear that it could not be revised sufficiently, so we have the initial drafting of the Constitution. The purpose is to kind of establish this central government that's going to deal directly with us as citizens, and it's going to be distinct from the state you live in. And to incorporate a system of checks and balances that would kind of preserve a limited government, i.e. each branch is going to have powers and authorities that the other branches don't have access to, and that's going to protect us. Because we still have this overarching goal to prevent one individual from having complete power. The framers do not want a king. They could have had a king. We could have had George Washington or another framer be named king. They don't want a king. They want a democracy. So as they work through the Constitution, the first three articles the first article, Article 1, establishes Congress, and it breaks Congress up further into the House of Representatives and the Senate, each one having kind of some distinct rights and powers the other one does not have. This Article 2 is very short, and it establishes the office of the president and lists out the powers of the president. Article 3 is even shorter than the other two, and it establishes that we are going to have a federal judiciary. So then your book deals with this case, McCulloch versus Maryland from 1819. Congress wanted to establish a bank, a federal bank, and Maryland decided, well, you can have a bank, but we're going to tax it. And so this case goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules the state of Maryland does not have the power to tax a congressional institution. This makes sense. Where the purpose of the Constitution is to limit government power and part of that is limiting state powers. Congress has some very specific powers in Section 8 of Article 1, including coining money, post offices, taxes, borrowing money, regulating commerce, raising and governing the military, and declaring war. They also have this necessary and proper clause, which allows them to enforce, have the power to enforce their enumerated powers, which is what we would call those. Article 2, again, executive branch. The Constitution enumerates that the president has the power to carry out the law, is commander-in-chief, can carry out the nation's foreign policy, and can appoint ambassadors, judges, and officials needed for the government to function, and he would be chosen by electors. The president's most significant actions need to be approved by the Senate. This includes treaties, judges, federal officials, reporting to Congress for the State of the Union, can recommend laws, but his most important duty is that he shall take care that all the laws are faithfully executed. Okay. Article 3 vests power in judicial branch. It establishes that federal judges are appointed by the president. They hold office for the rest of their life. This was supposed to limit their pull of factions and other entities. Congress does have the authority to limit certain types of cases from going to the Supreme Court, and the main role of the court is to interpret the laws. As part of the checks and balances, the president has the power to veto, but Congress can override that veto with a 2/3 majority. The president nominates Supreme Court justices, but the legislative branch can confirm or deny a nomination. The president is commander-in-chief, but the legislative branch is the entity that can declare a war and the entity that pays for it. So these are kind of the checks and balances that we see. Article 6 contains the Supremacy Clause. This establishes that federal law will be supreme when there's a conflicting state law. This establishes that the federal government, the Constitution, is the supreme law of the land, and that states cannot limit the power of the federal government, i.e. Maryland cannot tax a federal bank. The Constitution was signed in 1787. 3 members refused to sign. Initially, a big issue was a lack of Bill of Rights. So the federal government wasn't seen as doing enough to protect individual liberty. So this creates a ratification issue. Federalists favor the strong central government, but anti-federalists wanted a weaker central government, and they wanted a Bill of Rights to protect individuals. We have the amendment process being sat out. In December 15th, 1791, states had ratified 10 of 12 proposed amendments to ensure the national government would not interfere with individual liberties. So the purpose of the Bill of Rights, the purpose of the Articles of the Constitution establish government power. The purpose of the Bill of Rights establishes limits on government power to make sure that citizens have some specific protected individual liberties. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech. This is not just like speech all the time. You don't have freedom of speech from like your mom and dad, but the government can't tell you what to say or how to say it. The Second Amendment is the right to keep and bear arms. That Third Amendment prohibits the federal government from requiring us to house and feed federal troops. The Fourth Amendment protects our privacy and security. I don't really like this wording. The Fourth Amendment protects us from unreasonable search and seizures. Okay. The Fifth Amendment restricts how the government can treat people suspected of crimes. So this contains our Miranda rights. It gives our ability to be quiet in the face of questions that would incriminate us. It establishes due process for us. The Sixth Amendment requires that the government tell us what we're going to be accused of. It gives us the ability to confront witnesses against us, to subpoena witnesses, and to have defense counsel to represent us. The Seventh Amendment guarantees our right to trial by jury. The Eighth Amendment protects us against excessive bail and fines, cruel and unusual punishment. Meanwhile, the Ninth Amendment, was intended to kind of appease people who were worried that some of the rights might result in the government, that the rights weren't clearly enough articulated to keep the government from grabbing power. And the 10th Amendment specifies that any power not delegated to the United States is reserved to the state you live in or the people. Okay, so Constitution is a timeless document, as this notes, but it does have some specific problems. It fails to address slavery at all, and it does not incorporate those Bill of Rights to the states. So we don't have those things remedied until after the Civil War. After the Civil War, we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments added. One abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment one guarantees citizenship to those born here, and the 14th Amendment establishes that the states have to comply with the Bill of Rights, and it also adds in an equal protection clause. The states and the government cannot divide us up based on a classification like our race, our biological sex, and our sexual orientation, and treat us differently on those kind of classifications. So this was a little bit of a longer lecture, but I hope that it helps clarify kind of where the Constitution came from. Any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I hope you have a great first week.